So we're going to go ahead and start. And there may be more people that come in. They'll just have to find their way around here to the front to find seats. But anyway, a special welcome to everyone today, both here and virtually. I'm not sure they are actually able to attend virtually because we have a technical glitch. But at any rate, there are some, and this will be recorded and made available, so you can, if you miss something, you'll be able to go back and read it again. So we are celebrating the library's 100th anniversary this year and invite you to pick up a copy of The Town of Leesburg Celebrates Thomas Balch Library's 100 Years. They're on the back table. Copies of the Balch column listing programs, classes, tours, and exhibits is on the table in the back of the room, along with other informative literature about the library and events in the area. Events are posted on our website and on social media. The spring newsletter, which is just out, as well as all back issues, may be accessed in their entirety on our website. For those who may not know, the water fountain is out the door to the left. The restrooms are straight back. If you have any electronic device that you're not using as a note taker, but like phones or anything that will buzz, please turn off or mute. Masks are not required. If anyone would like to have one, please let me know. They're in a box on the back of the table. Please feel free to pick one up. It is my special pleasure to welcome our guest speakers, Lori Kimball and Steve Hammond. Lori Kimball is a familiar figure in the local preservation community, a member of the Black History Committee of the Friends of Thomas Balch Library, and works in the Historic Records Division of the Loudoun County Courthouse. Steve Hammond, also a member of the Black History Committee, a seventh-generation descendant of the Syphax family of Washington, D.C., will be sharing results of his extensive genealogical and historical research. I'm going to go ahead and save the next in case somebody comes on, but for those who are attending virtually, feel free to enter questions in the chat box. They will be taken at the end of the class. There will be an opportunity for you also to ask questions at the end of the class. So please welcome Ms. Kimball and Mr. Hammond.
Good morning. It's good to see you all. I want to add my thanks to the library for allowing us to put on the presentation today, do the class. It's been a couple years since I've been able to do it. Lori has kind of held the fort here, kind of maintained some consistency here, but I always enjoy doing these kinds of activities with people. It's all about sharing what we know and helping people get more familiar with African-American history, as well as our history in general. So I love being a part of this process. We have a lot to cover today. So I see a lot of people with pens and paper. You're going to need that. I've also given cards out to most everybody. I'll give my card to you all when we're done. So please take some notes, and we're probably going to give you more than you'll need or remember, but the key is to know that we're resources for you. So let's go ahead and get started here. Let's see, that one was even dated June of 2021. Before we get started, one of the things that I like to do is acknowledge the folks that, indigenous lands in our country. I'm going to be talking about, Virginia. There'll be a little bit of Maryland, but mostly Virginia and Louisiana and Mississippi. And so I'd like to read this acknowledgement. Many of my ancestors lived, worked, and died on land shown in this slide that we know today as the United States. In Virginia, my ancestors lived on the traditional territory and homelands of the Powhatan Nation. In Louisiana, my ancestors lived on the traditional territory and homelands of the Chitimacha Nation. And in Mississippi, my ancestors lived on traditional territory and homelands of the Choctaw Nation. I acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of these regions with their vibrancy and their connection to the land. I support their resilience and their strength that all the indigenous people have that have shown nationwide. So with that, let's go ahead and move on. Here's our roadmap for today. There's a lot here to consider. We're basically decided we're going to break it down into some case studies, things that we're working on. Lori will talk a little bit about the things that she's doing with the courthouse and within the county. And as Alexandria said, that I'm going to be talking a lot about my family, but how the information that I've collected might be useful as you all are thinking about the work that you do. So why do I research my ancestors? These are questions that I think that you all should ask yourself as well as you're beginning to do research, or even if you've been doing this for a long time. For me, I'm trying to seek truth and clarity. When I was originally brought into this, introduced to my family history, I was told family folklore and said, you're connected to the first family of the United States. And I said, get out of here. There's no way. And so that for me began a long journey in terms of trying to decipher, fact from fiction from folklore. And those things are hard to do a lot of times, but the work that you do really pays off. I want to honor and remember my family members. I want to expand my own knowledge, and I also want to expand other people's knowledge. Come on in, Donna. Feel free to have a seat here. I want to share the narrative. There are a lot of things here that I think are important in terms of how my family has affected our society. And I think you probably have stories like that as well. And then I want to educate and inspire others. So I hope that the energy that Lori and I bring today inspire you to do more as you're thinking about your own history. So I wanted to share with you how many ancestors have I actually identified. If we think about our pedigree chart and we go back 5 or 6 generations, we end up with like 132 ancestors, direct ancestors. Well, for me, so far, I have a database on Ancestry. How many people have an Ancestry database? There's a few of us. I have about over 4,000 people in my database. But of this, of my direct ancestors, I've only found about, 21%, which is pretty small. And I think that's reflective of not only being an African-American, but it's also impactful in terms of just the information is out there, but sometimes we just haven't found it yet. So I always think about this in terms of, I'm going to discover it. It's just waiting out there for me to find it. And so I just have to figure out which rock do I have to turn over in order to find that. So I want to put into context here that it's difficult to do this, but there are a lot of folks out there that we have an opportunity to learn more about. So African-American genealogy, I think the tools are the same with regard to whether we're doing kind of European or white genealogy, standard genealogy. It's just a little more challenging because a lot of those records are lost after, prior to 1870. And so there's this proverbial brick wall that we have to break through, and we have to figure out how do we put that information together. And we're hoping that today you'll see some tips that might be able to help you to do that. So as I start my part of this presentation, I want to challenge you to think about, why do you want to do your research? What is it that you're trying to do? What are your objectives? Some people simply want to have a pedigree chart, that shows how you're connected. Of course, now it goes out. Okay, so the pedigree chart there on the left, it simply shows how you're connected to all these people. Good morning, please come on in. Other people want to write a manuscript. Some people have a book in them. They want to tell the story and they want to be able to hand it off to their children or their grandchildren to say, here is what your lineage is. And that's really a powerful tool. And other people want to put together that family tree that you see down here, which is, can be pretty powerful. This is a picture of my family tree that we started back in 2009 for our first reunion. And it was really fun to do. I didn't bring it today, but it's a poster that's about 14 feet long and about 2-3 feet high. And there are a lot of people on there. But as soon as you do it, it's out of date, right? Because somebody is either born or somebody passes, or somebody gets married, and now it's out of place. So where do you start? Well, you start at the beginning, right? I think it's really important to think about, what is it that you already know? If you think about your family history, there are things that you've already learned. And those things are important to kind of get written down and to kind of know where you want to start. But you also want to begin with the present. what do we know today? The birth dates, the death dates, where people were born, that kind of thing, locations. But you also want to gather knowledge through family folklore. If there are people that are seniors in your family that you haven't interviewed or talked to, when you leave here today, make a plan to do that, because it's going to be important to just gather those tidbits. You never know what you're going to find, and you never know what tomorrow will bring, because they may not be here, and then you'll say, man, I should have done more, right? So think about that. We want to begin to separate facts from fiction, from that folklore that I talked about a little bit earlier, and we want to lay out a research strategy. You need to think about, I'm a scientist by training, and so I think kind of linearly, and I like to try to lay out what it is that I want to try to accomplish. So I think it's important to have a strategy, how you want to do it. You want to obtain information from other sources, which I think is one of the reasons you all are here, is like, where are the sources? Tell me where the good stuff is at, in terms of how to find that. And then we also want to ponder possibilities. When we think about DNA research and trying to connect pieces, we tend to it's okay to allow ourselves to jump ahead and think about what the possibilities are, but we can't assume that those things are correct. We've got to verify and validate using multiple methods. So first thoughts about genealogy records and where you can find them. Some simple things are Bibles. I think we all probably have a Bible in the house that, many of them people were writing down, in addition to having, all the other things that are there, they had the death and birth dates and marriages and stuff. Perfect place to start. So if you haven't looked at that or found the family Bible, take a look. The other thing is newspaper records. Man, oh man, there are so many things that are out there that are really amazing, that sometimes they're indirect information. And that's one of the things that I think is really important. Military records. How many people have explored military records? There's a lot out there, and if you haven't done it, it's worth taking a look at it. And a lot of people don't know whether people even served in the military, but it's okay to go in with that question, not knowing. Here are a couple of records. One on the left is Douglas Syphax, who is one of my Syphax cousins, distant cousin. He actually was in the United States Colored Troops and served in the Civil War, and he was located in Alexandria, and he actually lived and is buried in Arlington Cemetery in section 27. But these are things that people kind of get lost. We don't know that they're out there. All we have to do is dig just a little bit deeper to find that. Start with what you already have nearby. I talked about interviewing, seniors. Well, that's what I want to show on the left, is that if you haven't done an oral interview or just gone in and talked to them and written down the things that they have to offer, you should do that really pretty quickly. I was telling Donna this morning that we just lost a second cousin of mine. She was 98. We were pretty close, and so I've done a lot of work with her. She's the holder of our Syphax family history. And there's so much there. I mean, there are things that I wish I would have talked to her more about, but we were able to talk about a lot of things. But there's always that next question, to try to get their feedback. The other thing is looking at scrapbooks and letters and newspaper clippings, as I said earlier. Those things can be a treasure trove of items that allow you to kind of figure out how people were talking to one another, what was going on at the time, in terms of their circumstances. I'm constantly interested in not just the genealogy, but what prompted people to make certain decisions. And letters tell you, hey, weather's great, but we're having things going on, and they talk about the things that are going on during the day, at that time. And so those are very powerful. And then photographs. Photographs can say 1,000 words. This is a picture. My mom is in the upper left in the back row. She was the first Black nurse to graduate from the University of Colorado School of Nursing. I'm proud to say that she's going to be inducted into the Colorado Women's Hall of Fame on March 15th of this year, with all the work that she has done. So we're excited about that. But pictures start to paint, pictures of the bigger lives and how they're connected to each other and how they impact society. of course, funeral programs. I'm sure you all have done work in this particular area, but if you look at an obituary, it is a treasure trove, right?
Yes.
You can find so much information, and you can find out who was married to whom and who the grandkids are, you know, and you start to build this cloud of people around the person that we're honoring in terms of what their lives were like. This is Mickey Syphax. He was a prominent doctor in Washington, D.C., and he held a huge position at the Howard Medical Center, and really provided a lot of services to African Americans in the 20th century. So here's my condensed family tree. I didn't have an opportunity to bring my big family tree, but I wanted to share this tree with you because you're going to see it probably a couple of times today. And the stars are the folks that I'm going to kind of concentrate on my case studies. And so we'll talk about William Syphax there at the top, who was my fourth great grandfather. We're going to talk a little bit about Charles Syphax, and this is my third uncle and his wife, Mariah Syphax, who were owned by George Washington Parke Custis at the Arlington House, or the Arlington Plantation, which is now Arlington National Cemetery. And then we're also going to talk about my great-grandmother, Cora Joseph, who was born in Mississippi. So here's case study number one. We're going to talk about William Syphax. And so one of the things I like to do is to show, kind of contrast the folklore that I have, the things that I've collected through folklore, and the supplementary documents that are there, just so that you can kind of get a sense for the information that I have and where it came from. So the folklore is that this gentleman came from Canada. I'm trying to figure out how this Black man came to Virginia from Canada in 1773, which is when we think he was born. And so when I'm being told this as a kid, I'm saying, yeah, maybe. But as an adult, as I've done the research, it's like, yeah, we're finding some new things out. But, you know, there was the folklore is he lived in Mount Vernon. You can see itinerant preacher, fathered a lot of children. And then we have the items over on the right where we have federal census information, manumission deeds, freedom papers, letters and newspapers, books and articles, and DNA analysis. So all of those things put together help us create this great, you know, synthetic picture of William Syphax. So abstracts and indexes. If you haven't looked at these things in the areas where you are doing research, it's really important to do. There are a lot of people who have done a lot of work for you already. They have gone through records. And I would add Lori to this. She's done a lot of work here in the county, and she's a wealth of information in terms of people who are seeing these kinds of records all the time, or they're putting together an index that allows your work to be easier. So I would suggest that you think about looking for source summaries for various counties that would allow you to see if your ancestors are located there. Search courthouse records. Again, Lori's going to talk about this during her piece, but what I wanted to show you here is this is actually a courthouse record that shows the manumission of William Syphax. This record was basically created in 1831, but it shows that he was manumitted in 1817. And it shows the people who manumitted him, as well as people who attested to this activity that went on. The interesting thing here that this record can't tell you, that I can tell you, is that William bought his own freedom. I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but William bought his own freedom in 1817. The folks that were observers or attested to this, you can see down at the bottom right, or Benjamin Wood and Edward Stabler. They were Quakers in this area, and their goal was to try to, they were not only abolitionists, but their goal was to try to free people and to try to help them, find new lives. And so what we found here for the Syphaxes is that the Stablers had this interwoven story with our family. This is the first time we see Edward Stabler signing a document for the Syphaxes. But we have found them on about 18 other documents, 18 other places where they've helped to manumit our family members. So it's important to look for these kind of documents that might be helpful for you, and they might kind of open up a new line of research. The other thing I like to do is I like to apply the FAN principle. How many people are familiar with the FAN principle? I see a few hands. So FAN stands for family, acquaintances, and neighbors. So even though we may not know a lot about, say, William Syphax, we may be able to find out things about William by looking at who the people he interacted with, by his associates and his neighbors. And those things may help to fill in the picture and may provide some clues on where else we can look. So when we think about William's fan club, one of the things that I have done here is that I've looked at the manumission papers that I was showing you just before and started to look at censuses for the people who were also on there. Not just William, but the people who were the signers and the people that were that were attesting to this. And we can find all of them here in the 1820 census. And we can start to see who they're associated with. And we can start to learn a little bit more about what work that they did, what kind of activities were they involved with. So if you think about building your cloud, what your fan club look like, it might be helpful. So one of the things that I like to do, this slide is pretty complicated, so I don't want to overwhelm you, but this is one of the ways that I keep track of William Syphax. I want to know the facts of his life. I'm looking for the people who were associated with him during the period of his life. So if you look here, you can see a lot of different things. It runs from 1740 to about 1850 in terms of the timeline. So you can see I have it in terms of a timeline. And so I can take this piece of paper with me whenever I'm doing research. And it provides a reminder for me as a touchstone about the things that were going on in his life. And so then you can see over here on the left, a list of people who have had some interaction with William Syphax or were a part of his world, during his lifetime. And you can see we have John Gadsby, we have George Washington on there, we have John Carlyle, if you're familiar with the Carlyle House in Alexandria, and then we have the Stablers and the people that actually manumitted him. So I call that my pocket guide that allows me to kind of keep track of what's going on as a timeline. So this is the census. Everybody's kind of familiar with the census. We just had the 1850 census that just came out here. 1850. 1950 census that just came out. Well, here's the 1820 census. This is the first census that we find William Syphax. And the interesting thing here for African-American genealogy is that if there's an African-American who was on the census by name, they were free. We would not find an African-American on the census if they were enslaved. They would be a hash mark in terms of how they were owned. And I'll show you that more in just a couple of minutes. But I bring this up because this allows us to show that the 1870 piece of him buying his freedom becomes, more in line. We can kind of tie this together. So in 1820, he is free. And the interesting thing about this is you can see William is actually at the top of this list. William Syphax, how many people are familiar with the Carlyle House over in Alexandria? Okay, there's a few. If you get a chance, you should go over and do some walking around Alexandria. But there's this historical home that was built by John Carlyle, one of the founders of Alexandria, and he left this house to his daughter. And the interesting thing about this census is that in 1820, William Syphax is living in one of the outhouses in front of the Carlyle house. And so when we think about this census, we show William Syphax at the top. When you think about the enumerators, they're going from house to house to house, right? The next person on this list is Sarah Herbert. That's John Carlyle's daughter. So he went from enumerating William Syphax in his small cabin to the mansion where Sarah Herbert is actually living. So it shows the proximity that William Syphax was to these other people. So I think that's really important as you're thinking about what does a census tell you, not just about where William Syphax was, but where was he in connection to the other people that were in the space? The other thing here that about William Syphax, if we go back to manumission documents and things, is that we can also find William Syphax. He actually buys his daughters and his wife, and we found two deeds in which he has freed 6 different people. It's really pretty powerful. There are 2 deeds, one signed in 1827 and 1837. And this particular one talks about 3 of his daughters, and then the other one talks about his wife and other daughters. But then there's this newspaper article that talks about how he freed himself and how much he paid for each one of them. So these kinds of documents are out there. You just have to kind of dig for them. The other thing that's really powerful, we talked about letters. I'm trying to show an example of a letter. This letter was written by one of the stablers. Remember I talked about William Stabler was freed, or was one of the folks that attested to his freedom was by a stabler. Well, Stabler's son knew William Syphax as well. He actually wrote a letter in 1835, working to try to make sure that William Syphax was free. He sent this letter to one of his colleagues in Philadelphia because he thought William Syphax was up in Philadelphia soliciting money to try to free his family. But there was a lot going on in Washington, D.C. at the time, and he was worried that William Syphax, if he came back, he would be arrested and potentially lynched. This man actually sent a letter to one of his colleagues saying, hey, if you see William Syphax, let him know he probably shouldn't come back. So it's another powerful statement about somebody who cares about William Syphax, but also shows in connection what William Syphax was doing. Okay, case study number 2, Charles Syphax. So I'm going to move through this relatively quickly. We have a lot of information to share with you today, so I'm going to try to move through this a little bit quicker. But the Charles Syphax was owned by George Washington Parke Custis. How many people know who George Washington Parke Custis was? Okay, so a few people do. George Washington Parke Custis was the grandson of Martha Washington, and he inherited property in Arlington that allowed him to create the plantation, which Arlington National Cemetery now sits. When he moved there, he brought about 60 people that were enslaved. He also had a daughter with an enslaved woman by the name of Ariana Carter and named the daughter Mariah. Mariah married a Syphax. So the Syphaxes of this line are directly related to Martha Washington. So the things that I want to show you here's that pedigree chart that kind of shows how people are connected. But the other thing that's powerful is to start to think about how can you use maps to tell the stories of how people moved around and where they were. So here's a map that I put together that shows the extent of Arlington National Cemetery, that shows the plot of land that George Washington Parke Custis gave to his daughter Mariah. That's that gray triangle down there at the bottom. It shows the Freedmen's Village that was established there in 1863. And it starts to put together the stories that the Syphaxes in terms of how they interacted with our society. The other thing that I want to show here, which is more important than all of this, I think, is trying to get back to the use of the census. We've talked about trying to break through that brick wall. Well, to set the scene here, Mariah was sold. Mariah and Charles got married in 1821. And in 1826, Custis sold her to a stabler, and the stabler freed her. At the same time, George Washington Parke Custis gave her that 17 acres of property that I just showed you. But Charles Syphax remained enslaved. He was in charge of the dining room at the Arlington Mansion. So he remained free, he remained enslaved for a number of more years. And we'll talk more about that in just a second. But what I want to do here is to show you how I worked backwards to try to put the Syphaxes into context with where they were. So this is the 1880 census in Arlington. And you can see here all the Syphaxes that are listed on this document. And this is the actual census picture, and then I've transcribed it so that we can see it better here. But you can see Mariah Syphax here, mulatto female, kind of shows how all this family fits together. So we may take a step back, 1870 census. So we can see Mariah here again, and there are other people there. You can see how sometimes the census taker gets the names wrong, right? So we have to kind of work through that and try to figure out what's going on there. But this is 10 years earlier. We can start to see, put some pieces together. 1860. This is before the Civil War, right? Remember, Mariah was freed in 1825 or so, 1826. And you can still see a number of Syphaxes there, but look who's in this next block. This is Robert E. Lee's family. So the interesting thing here that I didn't tell you is that Mariah was the daughter of George Washington Parke Custis, but Mary Carter Custis married Robert E. Lee. And so the Syphaxes and the Lees are related through marriage. So when we think about that enumerator that's going down and hitting everybody, it's another example of how you can see where people are with regard to one another, with respect to one another. So what we can see is we can see Mariah, but the person that we haven't seen here is Charles. Where's Charles? Charles is not here because Charles is enslaved. So we're going to take one more. Let's go to this next piece here. So if we look backwards, this is the 1850 census. And my goal here is to show you, this is again showing Mariah. So this is the 1850 census, but this is a slave schedule. So this slave schedule actually shows the people who George Washington Parke Custis owned. When I say he shows the people, they are enumerated by each line, but it just says male, female. And it may show an age, okay? So all of these people on both of these pages are people that were, let's make sure I've got that. I need to go back one more, I think. Okay, so let me back up just a minute. One of the things that I wanted to show with this slide is that, and when we were looking at the 1850 census, this is still looking at Mariah and her group, I think. The important thing that I wanted to show here is that if you're looking for somebody at the bottom of one page, you must look at the next page. And what I've tried to show there is how, when you start looking at the different pages, once you put them together, you can see whole families. So it's important to take a hard look at multiple pages on either side of the person that you're interested in. Okay, so here's where Charles is. So I wanted to show you this. This is all of the people that George Washington Parke Custis owned that were enslaved. No names here except for Custis. Shows Custis. And these are all people. It just shows one. It shows male, age, that kind of thing. So where do we find Charles? So I did an enumeration of this, and these are the people that George Washington Parke Custis owned. So you could just kind of see an amalgamation of all of that stuff. So 53 males, 40 females, and it shows them broken down by age. So if we start looking at this a little bit closer, we can figure out, we know when Charles was born about because we have some other information, but we can actually start to look at this and try to figure out if Charles is actually shown on this page. And we believe that we have found him here by this red arrow. I could talk about this more when we get going, but I want to make sure we keep doing this. Manumission documents. The last one that I wanted to show here is with regard to, remember I talked about the Lees. Robert E. Lee ends up leaving the U.S. Army and going to the South. But one of the things that he was the the executor for his father-in-law, George Washington Parke Custis. And when George Washington Parke Custis died in 1857, he basically said, I'm going to free my enslaved people, but they can be, they'll be freed within 5 years of my death. So Charles is still enslaved there. And George Washington, Robert E. Lee has the responsibility of paying off all of his father-in-law's debts and freeing people. Well, and finally in 1862, December 29th, just before the Emancipation Proclamation, Robert E. Lee signs a deed freeing the remaining people at Arlington House. And one of the first people that's there is Charles Syphax. So this is a paper that shows Robert E. Lee freeing his brother-in-law, remember, related by marriage, to show that, that these folks are free. I know that's a lot. I'm going to turn it over to Lori now. And we'll see if we can keep moving. Did we get that? And we're also going to. Okay, there you go.
Thank you. Thank you. So as Steve pointed out also, these are just some tips, things to keep in mind as you are doing your research, starting with what you know, but also looking at every document that you can and not just stopping at the census records or a deed or a will, and I'll talk more about that. And of course, we know to not trust automatically everything online, everything that's online, especially the family trees. And we could probably do a whole presentation on the things that we have learned that are wrong on the family trees. That's okay. And to go, to go back and recheck indexes and collections, many repositories, including the one where I work, we are constantly updating with new things. So it's time consuming, yes. If you keep a good research log, you'll know what you've already looked at, but to go back and, and look at those again, I'll have a little example of that. And then when you are requesting information from a repository, especially as you're depending on asking someone in another location where you can't go physically, it's really important to do your homework first and look to see if they have online indexes or if you can figure out the deed numbers and documents, because many places, including like where I work, we cannot do that research for people. So when somebody calls us and says, give me everything that you know about my house, we can't do that. But if you're asking for a specific deed or you're asking for something specific, that's really helpful. So just another tip about that one. So I'm going to focus mostly on the records and the information available here at the Thomas Balch Library and at the Loudoun County Courthouse. But it's broad enough that even if you're researching somewhere else, you still may use the resources here at the Thomas Balch Library, and you may find books and other pieces of information that can help you, but also what to do to ask the questions. Do you have these things in the county where you're doing the research? So we are fortunate in Loudoun County. We have most of our records back to 1757. Other counties have either had records burned during the Civil War or through just fires throughout the years or mold, or frankly, some places just didn't care about the historic records. We've been really lucky. And so these are just some of the records that to look at. And at the Thomas Balch Library. Benefits here, they have very, very helpful staff. Lots of books, microfilm, family papers, local research. A courthouse has legal documents. We do not have family trees and generic non-legal records like that. So your local history and genealogy library or a historical association would have that. Also here, the African American Architectural Survey of Loudoun County, which is being updated through a project that is here as well. Also here, online subscriptions, Steve mentioned looking at books where the abstracts of deeds and other documents or indexes. Pat Duncan has done a lot of books, and they are available here at Balch, and not just for Loudoun County, but other counties as well. And the land tax maps, I'll show an example of that, using mapping to understand where the people you're researching, where they were, and movement. Wayne Safford, local historian, has done, he mapped Loudoun County and then some of the adjacent counties as of 1860. And those maps are really, they've been very helpful to me and others. And Black History Committee books, family histories, again, here at Balch. But if you're not researching, in Loudoun County, you can ask in the county you are doing the research. On microfilm, newspapers, marriage records, deeds, and most, you can see that here. Online subscriptions such as Ancestry, Fold3, and others, you can come in. So if you're not researching you're researching in South Carolina, you can still use these online subscriptions if you don't pay for them at home to do that work.
Could you go back for just a second?
Mhm.
The last one you have, that one doesn't ring a bell.
Yeah, it's people uploading information about their research that they have done. And you can also, I'm not sure if all of it is now still subscription based, and some of it is free access. And then some other online databases here at Balch, but they are free access. There's a cemetery database, freedom seeker ads, indexes to the oral histories and the surveys and so forth. And resources at the courthouse, which is where I work. So the legal documents, the deeds, the wills. I'm going to talk more about wills because don't stop at the wills. You should look at the estate records as well. We have, out of what were called at courthouses loose papers, we have over the years, and I say we, it was many people before I ever got there doing this work in terms of separating these documents by topic. And so that was judgment records, criminal cases, the free black papers, papers about enslaved people, road cases, and so forth. And I'll talk about some of those. At the courthouse, we have a link to our online indexes. So this is all of these names that you see here, these record groups that you see here, there are indexes to them. So you can't see the actual document, but that's where you get started in going through there and saying, okay, I want deed number this and this and this, so that when you contact us, that's the record we would look for. And I'll point out that maybe in March, but maybe more likely April, we should have our indexes in a database with some images online. And so a bigger online database where you can actually look at more information than we have here. And in some cases get they're watermarked images, but you can see the images of the documents and then request them if you don't. So that's a big step for us. We're in the process of uploading images every day. And so looking at one in particular, we have decided to organize the access to the records with records that pertain to Black history, so that it is easier to do the research to go directly to papers that have that are referencing births and death, what we call the enslaved papers. And then also a little further down, you can see the start of the indexes for the free Black papers. And this is what one of our indexes looks like right now. It is nothing more than an Excel spreadsheet. But as I said, in March or April, you'll be able to look at this in a different way. And the highlight I have here is I can look at this index by the enslaver's name, and I'm going to do a case study to show you records related to George Carter. George Carter and his wife Elizabeth Carter owned Oatlands and lots of other properties in Loudoun County. And I'm going to start here with his will. So some things to keep in mind when you're looking at a will: when it was written and when it was submitted to the courthouse for probate. And that gap can be very long. So it's easy to look at the will and it says, I signed a George Carter and here's the date. But if he didn't die for many years later, there's a lot that could have changed in that time. With this instance, it's only 4 years, but there were changes. In his will, and I'm going to point out, this is, how can I explain this with the legal records? At a courthouse, when something was brought in like a will, The clerk of the court took the will and then recorded it, wrote every word out into a will book. And so we are fortunate we have most of the wills that were brought in for the estates. And they're in separate packets, but you can look at those. But it's the will book that you'll look at the courthouse. So this is the clerk of court just writing across the page. And that's an example here of the clerk wrote George Carter's will into the will book. And that's the official record at the courthouse, is that will book. And so you can see here, there are references to, on this little snippet of George Carter's will, men named Emmanuel and Julius, and then Alanda and Gerard Day. Now, I first looked at what was written into the will book, and that was helpful. But then later, and I should point out that I was doing this work when I was at Oatlands, when I looked at the actual will that the courthouse has for George Carter, he actually, how he wrote it in his will, if there was a married couple or a family, he grouped them together line by line, not written across the page, like of course the clerk of court would do in saving paper. So it would have saved me a few little bits of research had I looked at that original will, which is the point I'm trying to make. If you can look at an original document, do that. It's not that you shouldn't look at both, but had I looked at that, I would have made some of the family connections earlier than I did. But the legal record is what's written into the will book. And so we have Emmanuel and Julius here. This was written, George Carter's will was written in 1842. The Carters were the largest enslavers in Loudoun County by 1860, 133 people enslaved by them. And 1842, it's a big stretch to 1870, the census, when you're going to see formerly enslaved people listed for the first time. But fortunately, with the Day family and researching them at Oatlands, many of the people were still young enough that they were showing up in the 1870 census. But working backwards here from the, I'll go back in order with the census records. We see in the 1900 census, looking for Emmanuel Day, this is Emmanuel, age 35. So we already know that's not the Emmanuel we were just looking at in an 1842 will. It doesn't work out that way. But this is Emmanuel Day and his family living in an area near Oatlands called Gleedsville. And as we go back in time in the census records, here is Emmanuel when he is much younger, 1840. So also remember the 1890 census records you're not going to find. 1880. But look who's in this household with Emmanuel Day. We have Julius, age 90, and Jenny, age 86, the father and mother of Jenny, who is age 45, and Emmanuel Day, who's 61. That's the Emmanuel Day, the age 61 Emmanuel Day is the one who was listed in George Carter's will. And again, had I looked at the original will of George Carter, Jenny is, I think she was, her name was written as Jenny in the will, but she is listed with Emmanuel in that originally written will. The clerk of the circuit court just wrote it out across the page, but they were husband and wife and recognized as such by the Carters. But look at the ages. And even if the census taker, really, even if they're off by 10 years, the Day family descendants who live in Loudoun County, and there are a number of them, can seeing by the census record, take their family all the way back to about at least 1800 if the census taker is off by 10 years in age, but maybe even into the late 1700s with their ancestors, which is really sometimes very, very difficult to do in doing the research, but they have that knowledge from this census record, but also piecing together the things from George Carter's will. And then going back to 1870, here's Emmanuel, age 50, and others in the household. So piecing together, his wife is Virginia, they have a son named Emmanuel for the grandfather. Okay, now, here's something that, as I said, go back and keep looking at records. Now I have the benefit because I work at the courthouse and I was processing this record, but to go back and look at records, because just last week, I found this record in about Emmanuel Day. It's in a record group called a judgment. Those were all parts of loose papers. A judgment was like sort of like a small amount of money kind of claim. It wasn't a big lawsuit back then. It was a judgment. It was still legal. It was still like a lawsuit, but it was either locally at the courthouse or they would take it to Superior Court. But we have all those papers all wrapped up. We're unfolding them. And I came across this judgment for George Carter versus Joseph Hawkins, who happened to be President Monroe's farm manager just down the road from Oatlands. Now, Monroe is dead by then, so I'm not sure if Joseph Hawkins is still there. But it is because George Carter hired out Emmanuel, and Joseph Hawkins did not pay for what he was supposed to do in terms of hiring him in money and the clothing that was to be provided. And so George Carter took him to court. George Carter sued everybody. And so he took him to court. And this is, a very awkward and disturbing part of the Day family's history. But I immediately took a picture of the judgment and sent it to one of the descendants. And as she said, it is a disturbing record to have as part of our history, but it's valuable to her to have that, to know here's a piece of Emmanuel's story that she didn't know before, and could very well be related to other Day family descendants as well. So, that will go into our indexes, but that wasn't there 2 weeks ago. So you just sort of have to keep going and going. And then another person that I mentioned, Gerard Day, he was identified in George Carter's will and is still showing up he does show up for the first time in the 1870 census in the household of George Carter's son, George, and his wife. So we do know from research at Oatlands that a number of formerly enslaved people did still continue to live on the property after freedom came, until they started to purchase land in the 1870s nearby, not from the Carters, but nearby, and that's how Gleedsville was formed. So even though, you're looking at 1870 and people are now freed by then, go back to, if you have any idea of who the enslaver was, go back and look at those records. And another one, Joe Rust is another family who listed by last name in the census. So it's also a myth that enslaved people were never listed by last name in documents. Sometimes they were, not often. I mean, it doesn't happen all the time. But it's also a myth that they always had the surname of the people who enslaved them. I think in relation to Oatlands, we may have uncovered perhaps one family who had the last name of Carter, but everybody else had a last name of their own and not the Carters. Birth records. So this is, I'm showing you a couple things here. At the bottom is from one of our indexes at the courthouse, but I was first looking at these records in one of Pat Duncan's books, but linking together. So you can see in this index to the birth registers so Elizabeth O. Carter, so how this was done, at least in Virginia, was the vital records started to be kept in 1853. So it's really difficult to find much before that. But sometimes there are references. I'm talking about vital records, but Elizabeth Carter seemed to be fairly consistent with recording with the county births and deaths. And it would list the enslaver's name. It might list the child's name. It might list the mother's name. It depends on what the enslaver or the informant recorded. But in here we see that Hebe was born in 1857, and the mother is listed as Harriet. And when we go to the first available document that we can really look at, which would be the 1870 census, here is Hebe Fisher in the household of George and Catherine Kate Carter, the son and daughter-in-law of George and Elizabeth Carter at Oatlands. And then Harriet, I don't have a record here for it, but Elizabeth Carter, who moved out of Oatlands and went to one of her other plantations during the Civil War, that Harriet is living out at that plantation when the 1870 census is recorded. So linking those two records together. Chancery cases can be sometimes just a wealth of information. Chancery cases are legal records, they're lawsuits that are cases of equity. So very often they involve when someone dies, and even if they had a will, but especially if they did not have a will, that there's no other way, like the property has to be divided up. And if the family can't come to an agreement with it, and even if it's spelled out in the will, the family may still disagree with it. They take it to court to say, okay, let's have some impartial person or decide, or judge, but some impartial person, how to divide up equitably the property. And as we know, enslaved people at the time were considered personal property. So it would be personal property and real property. And some of them contain all kinds of genealogical information. And let me go back to that one. In Virginia, every county is different, but Loudoun County's chancery records are scanned and they are available online at the Library of Virginia under the Virginia Memory Project. So up until 1912. And the Library of Virginia is bringing up county by county by county. So there's a lot out there, but they're not all there. And they do end at a certain period of time. But I think that they all go through the time period of slavery. And they can just be a wealth of information. Here is one this is John Elgin's estate versus Alexander Lucas and others. And so I'm looking at this chancery case I know that John Elgin's family, or John Elgin, sold land to people formerly enslaved at Oatlands. And that's how the little community of Gleedsville was formed. And so in looking at this chancery case, he is mentioning people here related to the Day family case study that I was talking about, Gabriel Day and some others. But what else is sometimes in the chancery case are what are called plats. In this case, they were trying to prove who could walk through somebody's property to get to the main road. And so this has a little plat to it. And Steve mentioned using maps and things like that to try to understand the people you're researching, where they were. And this is really helpful in understanding where people were in Gleedsville, because sometimes, as you know, with the deed, you either don't get any meets and bounds and you have no idea, or it's all about a white oak and a stone. And so this was helpful to us. So let's talk about wills and estate accounts a little bit more. And this is my second case study. And when I started out researching, and I don't know about you, but I would look at the will, and if I didn't find anything, I was like, there's nothing in here, or I stopped there. And don't do that, because there are, just like today, there are appraisals, there are inventories, and there are others estate documents that go with a will. And those are often the ones with the good information in it. And they're also done, after in terms of researching people who were enslaved or even who were free. The will may have been done at a certain time, but it's the estate documents that are after the fact and more current in time period. And so this case study is the will of Joseph Lewis Jr., who happened to be the first husband of Elizabeth Carter from Oatlands. And she was married to Joseph Lewis Jr. He was a delegate, both a federal and state politician. And he wrote his will in 1830, submitted for probate 4 years later. And in his will, he identified people he was manumitting at his death. And he provides all the names, and he references Harry and Patty were already emancipated. Madison and Lee will remain enslaved until they are age 25. And he told Joseph Lewis Jr. instructed his executors to have them be taught a trade. Let me go back there. But who does not get freed in the will? Everyone gets freed except a woman named Mariah. And the belief being that she was to remain with Elizabeth Carter as what they would have referred to back then, as a personal using the word servant, a person, someone personal and close to Elizabeth, like a lady's maid or something like that. So we have learned later, both through research in the census records, but because many of the descendants of people mentioned in Joseph Lewis's will still live in Loudoun County. This was the Bryant family. These are all Bryant family members, but Mariah still remains enslaved. And so going further, so looking at Joseph Lewis's will, you think, wow, most everybody but Mariah was manumitted. But that's really not the case, because we find in later accounting records, which I know are hard to see here. At the top it lists, these are the men who are supposed to be freed as of the will. But as we go through some of the accounting records, we see that, so there's an executor, just like today, an executor of Joseph Lewis's will, that in the accounting records, Greg Bryant, who was supposed to be freed, he's still being hired out during this time period. And in digging deeper into the estate documents, that's because the estate was never finally settled for many years. So that's why it's important to continue going through those records. Now, all of the Bryants did, they were freed. So that did happen, but not as quickly as you might think just by looking at the will. So key to keep on going. Also, in this estate accounting, it was, I just already talked about that. Let me go back. No, actually, in the inventory and appraisal. So in this case, this is listing out, it's a very detailed inventory for Joseph Lewis. Sometimes you don't get that, but this one we did. And so it's going through every single farm, animal, every single item in the household, which I think is on this next slide. I'll come back to that. But it's listing out his prize horses. So keep in mind, Joseph Lewis is prominent. He has a good amount of money. He has prize horses, and then so he calls them bred horses. And then he has the working animals for the farm. And so in trying to understand what Greg and Madison and Lee and other Bryant family members perhaps did, and how and what they labored at Joseph Lewis's plantations, it's not Joseph Lewis working with these horses, of course, right? It's the people he enslaved, and probably the men. And so there is, in piecing together the story in an awkward way, it was that knowledge that Greg and Madison and Lee and others would have had about how to work with these horses, the breeding of them, and so forth. While they were at his plantation was called Clifton. And inside the house, it was a very detailed inventory, room by room by room of what's in that house. And if you were an enslaved person laboring in the house, these are items and rooms and things they would have been very, very familiar with. And especially as you are talking about things up on the second floor of the house, if you were going to visit the Lewises at their house, you probably got no further than the parlor or some fancy room. The people who were enslaved and labored in the house saw all of this, every day. And you can imagine in putting together the story of the Bryants that they're seeing these items. Let's pick one that is breakable. I don't know, the washstand ewer. You're handling it, and this is something that they would have known about, but also probably living in fear of, oh my gosh, what if I drop this? What if I break it? What horrible thing might happen to me? So again, it's an awkward way, but a way of seeing, putting into context the people who were enslaved there and living there and saw these things every day. And it's something also, this came about, some of these slides, as a discussion with historic site museums about, well, we don't really have people's names. We don't really know how to interpret slavery because we don't have names. Well, you have a house, you have the land, and if you have an inventory like this, you have stuff to work with in terms of telling that broader story. Let's see, so now I'm going to jump into just some of these. I'm still on the Bryants. linking some of the papers together, these legal papers with the Bryant family case study is we have, and I'm going to use the term that of the what's written on the ledger book at the courthouse, that what's called the Register of Free Negroes. And then we also have the freedom papers for people. So they're two different things, but people had to come in once they achieved their freedom to register. They're supposed to do it every year, but that didn't. Sometimes it's many, many years in between. But here's an example of a record we have at the courthouse for Lydia Ann Bryant. She was the daughter of Eliza. Eliza is mentioned in the will. She was, and it says in there, the register should say how they were freed. That might be, it's a white person testifying. For example, I know that so-and-so was born free. In this case, Lydia was not, but the person who is witnessing is saying she was emancipated by the last will and testament of Joseph Lewis, and then describes her and it gives her age. She's 6 years old. Okay, now stopping the case studies and just doing some different records to look at. So you don't often find one of the broadsheets about with freedom seekers, but this is one from Loudoun County. A group, it's actually from the Christmas Eve escape, a group who escaped on Christmas Eve, 1855, I think it was. But it tells who is looking for them. And in going to the great resource that we have here at the Balch Library with WINS maps, able to go directly to, so we have McVeigh and Rogers. And we can go right to WINS maps, and you can see on the red and the green arrows exactly where those plantations were, to know exactly where those enslaved people left to seek their freedom. So looking for maps and trying to figure out where those names were, very helpful in placing people. These are documents, we have some at the courthouse, but these are in the Library of Virginia, I think they're there for all counties. They are for Loudoun. They're called petitions. As of certain different times in Virginia law, you had to petition. You were supposed to leave after you were freed. You were not supposed to stay in the Commonwealth, but you could petition to stay. And in 1837, the law changed that you could petition the county in which you lived. But before that, you had to petition the General Assembly. And I have a whole case study and research on Ned Davis, which we won't go into today, but they petitioned the state to stay in the Commonwealth. And this is the petition, which is really difficult to read, but it is the petition for Ned Davis, Patrick Hogan, Aaron Davis, and Daniel Webster to remain in the state. So taking this, I think it was from 1849. But then piecing those names together and I was looking at Ned Davis, where exactly was he living, and we figured that out. But this is a good source to know how early, I did not know at the time how early he had been freed, and this told me it was at least 1849. And of course, newspapers, Steve talked about that. Other things that we have at our courthouse, so if you're looking at another courthouse, ask them. We have what's called a charter book, and there was a law in Virginia that I think, I forget the year, you were supposed to go in and register if you were starting an organization. Didn't always happen, but this one is for the formation of the Emancipation Association, which was a prominent organization here in Loudoun County, founded in 1890. And these are excerpts from the charter book and the men who signed that and that charter. Judgments, I mentioned before with that example with George Carter suing Hawkins with the hiring out of Emmanuel. This is another one really related to the Arcola quarters for the enslaved and trying to understand the people who were enslaved there, and the Darn family and the Lewis families who enslaved the people there. This is a judgment where Catherine Darn, so it's not always the men. So that's another myth. It's always the men. The women weren't involved in this stuff, which is absolutely not the case. Catherine Darn, there are a number of judgments from Catherine Darn, and she hired out a man named Arthur to John Washington T. and McIntyre, and they did not pay for what they were supposed to. And so she took them to court. Another register, which we do not have for Loudoun County, and it's such a tragedy, and we don't know if one was ever kept, but after the Civil War and during the time of the Freedmen's Bureaus, we don't know if it was a law or it was just this thing this activity you were supposed to do, but to keep a register in your county of formerly enslaved people who came in to register their marriage, because it wasn't legally recognized during the time of slavery, but family recognized it, neighbors recognized it, even the enslaver could recognize it. The Carters did at Oatlands, but they were supposed to go into the courthouse and register. And so I'm always looking through the other counties' registers, because you can search on Loudoun and see who might have lived in Loudoun, but now was registered somewhere else, like in Augusta County. They've got to be, for your research, valuable. I've just not found anything for my research for people in Loudoun. They're on the Library of Virginia website, so that's free. And here are some links. I've been mentioning the Library of Virginia. Here's the link to it, the Virginia Memory Project. And by the way, if you want copies of this PowerPoint, you can email the library and they can send out a copy. And some others, which I want to sake of time, I'm not going to go through all of them here, but locally, the Afro-American Historical Association in Fauquier is another great local source. But I want to talk a minute about Last Seen, Finding Family After Slavery, and it's informationwanted.org. Oh, before I do that, here's a list from Bronwyn Souders of the Waterford Foundation. Bronwyn and John Souders have done extensive research around the Waterford area. And this is a list of names. She told me to include this slide of names that they have researched. And this is a mix of both of names here. And so with Bronwyn's email address, if you're looking for any of those surnames. But Last Seen at informationwanted.org. After the war, thousands of formerly enslaved people ran ads in newspapers seeking information about their family members who had been sold away, who they have lost contact. They were sold, and they're trying to reconnect. And they ran in a lot of religious newspapers, not all religious newspapers, but saying, please publish this in, another newspaper near St. Louis or somewhere. And at the top is that we've mentioned the name Gleedsville, and that little village got its name from Jack Gleed. Here in Last Seen is an ad placed by Lucy Gleed from the widow Carter's Oakland. Well, it's Oatlands. It's spelled incorrectly, but you get it. Near Leesburg. And she can be reached at Daniel Russ's house. And she's looking for her daughter. She can be at Daniel Russ's house. So I mentioned Joe Rust was one of the men enslaved by the Carters, listed by last name in the will. And this is one of the families, Daniel Rust. It has been spelled both ways in documents, but part of John Rust's family. And then another one, I was helping someone research their Berryman ancestors and found this ad this is a woman in New Jersey, Permelia Muse, searching for her ancestors, and she lists them all. They are in the census here. Jefferson Berryman in Virginia, but she's looking for some of his sons, and she's looking for was probably his daughter, who was probably sold somewhere in Missouri. And so I found Permelia Muse in a tree on Ancestry. I emailed the person who put up the tree. We emailed for a while, and then just stopped hearing. So I've made really not a whole lot of progress, except that her name is Permelia. Jefferson's grandmother was named Permelia, and a descendant of his son, George Jackson Berryman, they named a daughter Permelia. So it is connected, pretty good connection there with this is all related family. And that my note about going back and checking again. So 2 days ago, I went back into Information Wanted and went back, and there's another posting for a Berryman. No names I'm familiar with. They don't mention Loudoun, but the people had been sold to someone in Missouri. So I'm thinking, there's something here. So And the defendant that I'm working with, we talked about this on Tuesday night, and we need to look back there and do some more digging there. So go back and look. And you can absolutely go down a rabbit hole with information wanted. I mean, I was that night looking at people I'm not even researching, but it's fascinating. But there's a lot in there and it keeps getting updated. People are transcribing. And that's my email address. So thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, Steve, I will try to get this switched over to you.
So we're going to switch over. If you want to stand up for a minute and stretch, now would maybe be a good time as we try to go back to the other
I thought I
slide.
could go here.
We're going to talk about DNA on this last
Mhm.
last stretch here.
Does it show?
Okay.
Okay, so let's settle back in again. And as you're sitting down, what I want you to do is work with me. I want you to pretend like you're buckling your seatbelt. Because we're gonna spend the last bit of this thing trying to get to a lot of slides, but let's see. So there's a lot to share here, and what I don't want you to do is run out of here saying, "Oh my gosh, there's too much information. This is." Remember, I'm a retired scientist, and I love this kind of stuff. And my goal today is to get you excited about the possibilities of how you use DNA to break down walls. And so hopefully we will be able to accomplish that. So I want to start this stretch by again showing you my family tree. This is the family tree that we created for the Syphax side of my family. And you can see how it's broken down with colors, which are different branches of the family. That blue section in the middle are all Syphaxes who are descended from George Washington Parke Custis and Martha Washington. It's a pretty wide swath. And over on the left in the gold, you can see that's where my line is. You can see the star down there towards the bottom. And these folks are associated with Nancy Syphax. This was Charles's sister. And she was enslaved by John Gadsby at the Decatur House, if you know where Decatur House is in Washington, D.C. So there's a whole history of things there. The main thing I want to show you with this slide is what I've done is I've overlaid on this all of the people who are in the Syphax side of the family who have taken a DNA test. And you can see all the dots. All of those people have taken the DNA test. Some have taken one test. Some people have taken multiple tests for other things that we're looking at. So I just want to illustrate here that as you're thinking about DNA, it's important, one, to have questions in mind, but understand who you can get the most information out of in terms of the test that they might take. And we'll come back to that. So here is my ethnicity. When you think about DNA research, the question is, where do you start? And kind of like when we started earlier this morning, it depends. It depends on what it is you're after. Some people are interested in their ethnicity. You remember the ancestry commercial where the guy's wearing the quilt and then he realizes that he's in the wrong country and he has to do all that stuff. People are just interested in terms of what DNA tells where they're from. And you can see for me, I'm from all over. Got a lot of connections to a lot of different places. But other people are interested in DNA comparisons. That is using the data to try to answer other questions by comparing that information to others and to see if we can make some determinations as a result of that. And so on the right-hand side, I just want to illustrate that, you can use your parents, you can use your children, siblings, and other close family members to try to start to answer some of those questions. There are several types of DNA. First of all, let me ask, how many people have taken a DNA test in the room? So some people have. So there are 4 types of DNA that people generally look at when they're doing this kind of work. The one that we are most familiar with on the commercials is autosomal DNA. And that DNA is DNA that's passed down. It is, here's autosomal DNA, and you can see that the arrows show that you get autosomal DNA from both parents. It's not always equal, but you get DNA from both parents, and then you pass that on to your kids and so on and so forth. So that is the thing that we see on the commercials about ancestry that says, hey, you want to kind of learn about your history. This allows you to do a lot of that work. Other types of DNA include Y-DNA. You may have heard of this. The Y-DNA is passed down from father to son. It's only a male-dominated DNA. Women don't have a Y chromosome. There's also the X chromosome, which is passed down. We all have an X and a Y. So fathers pass their Y to the sons, and they pass the X to the daughters. So that's how they can kind of connect back to dad, in addition to their autosomal DNA. And then mom has 2 X's. And so the X's go to both the father, to both male and female children. And then the last of the 4 is the mitochondrial DNA. And mitochondrial DNA is a female DNA. Mom passes it on to her children. She can pass it on to both son and daughter, but only the daughter can pass it on. A son, I got my mom's mitochondrial DNA, so I could look back at her female line, but I can't pass it on to my kids. So depending on what questions you're trying to ask, it kind of tells you who you have to contact to get to take a test so that you can answer some of those questions. And I'll show you a couple of examples of that as we proceed. So everybody got their seatbelt on? Okay. So one of the things I want to show here is that this is my ancestry connection to my second cousin, Donna Kunkel. She's my genealogy buddy. So another one of those things to remind you about in terms of your work is find a genealogy buddy, somebody who you can work with, can bounce questions off of, who you can travel with, who has some similar interests as you. And Dawn and I have been working together for probably 35 or 40 years. She lives in California, I live in Virginia, and so we stay in close contact, and we've been doing this for many, many years. She's also a Syphax family member, and she's also a GLEAD Syphax family member who has ties here in Loudoun County. So I just want to show you, she's a second cousin. We share a total length of 254 centimorgans. So I want you to think about a centimorgan, or CM for short, as a piece of thread. We have about 7,000 centimorgans of DNA in our body. So think about this long spool of thread. And Dawn and I share 254 of those units together. But just that little bit of information allows us to learn a lot about our family members. The other thing that I want to show here is that DNA, the amount of DNA that you share with people varies with relationship. So you look at my children here, they share about half of my DNA. Remember we said about 7,000? So you can see both my daughters here have over 3,000, about 3,400. One is 3,389, close to 3,400. So where did the other half come from? Came from mom. So that's where they get to the 7,000. So when you have a person you share DNA with that's that high, you're talking about either a parent, who you got your DNA from, or a child that you gave your DNA to. The second one there is a sibling. This is my brother. We share about 2,500 centimorgans. So it's a little bit less because there's a mixture that happens when the autosomal DNA is shared. Second cousins, you can see it's in the 250 to 200, maybe to 350 kind of numbers. And you can see my cousin Donna's there in the middle, the 254. And then we have fifth to eighth cousins. Look how small that is. Only about 10, 12. So the further you get apart, the lower the DNA is, but there's still things that we can learn from that. Yes.
Can I ask like you have at the title, amount of AT, is that a title?
Amount of autosomal DNA. That's AT is short for autosomal DNA. Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. Okay, so we each have 23 chromosomes in which we carry these 7,000 centimorgans of DNA, autosomal DNA. So the next slide I want to show you is how my cousin Donna and I share DNA across our chromosomes. So there are 23 chromosomes. There's a male chromosome and a female chromosome. So for each one of these, there's a pink and a blue, mom and dad, okay? So what you see in the green there are the stretches. Remember we talked about sharing 254 centimorgans? If we add it all up, if we add all these little pieces up, it would add up to 254. But the point is we share DNA. And the thing to think about with this is how our parents gave us their pieces of DNA. It's not all consistent. It's all over the place. And it just so happens that Donna and I happen to match on these spots. And she's going to match other cousins in different spots because they got different DNA. Does that kind of make sense? You with me? Okay. Everybody's seatbelts are tight, right? Okay. All right. So I just want to show you this so you can get a sense as we talk a little bit more about where we're going. Okay. Next slide. So in order to use DNA, you got to start with a question. This goes back to what we talked about at the beginning of the class, right? Think about where you want to go. Don't just jump into the deep end of the pool. Have an idea where you're headed. And so, do you want to understand where your ancestors came from? These are all fair questions. Who are my genetic relatives? Can I locate a birth parent? And that's a big deal for a lot of people who maybe were given up or adopted, just don't know who their parents were. Can I identify a common ancestor with another test taker? So, and there are many other questions. I throw these out just to get you thinking about the kinds of things that you can do with DNA. So here is a condensed version of my family tree for to show you a group that I'm working with for this project that I'm working on that I'm going to share with you. So the person at the top, CJ, is my great grandmother. Her name is Cora Joseph. And she had several children. And what I'm showing you here is 4 of her daughters and her son and their descendants. And then lower, you can see these folks in boxes. All the folks in green are in the project and they've taken a DNA, they've taken the autosomal DNA test, okay? So you can see how we got a pool. It's across different branches of our tree. And then we also have these folks that are in these kind of rust-colored circles. And these folks have taken a mitochondrial DNA test. And what you can tell here, what I want to illustrate is that even the mitochondrial DNA, remember, tells us about our female ancestry. So you can see this is Lawana Carter, who, bless her soul, just passed last week at 98. she's a second cousin of mine. Here's where I'm at. But Luana is here, her mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, all female line. Roland Jefferson, mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, female line. You follow where I'm going? So all of these folks have a direct female line back to Cora. So that's important when we're looking at trying to understand how mitochondrial DNA can help us answer questions. Okay, we're going to start seeing more numbers here, so don't glaze over on me, okay? So the next thing that I want to show you is how all of us are related to one another, okay? And the way we're going to do that is we're going to take, remember I was showing you how Donna and I had shared 254? The next slide I'm going to show you is how we all relate to one another, okay? Okay. So this is a table that takes all of the people that are in this project and shows how do we relate to one another. So if we look at Steve here, and Donna is Joseph number 2 for the use of this document. We can come over here to Joseph number 2, and there's the 254. Okay, so just trying to show you that, you know, the consistency here. But the thing I want to show you is how, you know, this table is full of numbers, and you see, look how varied it is. But remember, the higher the DNA, the closer we are together, right? And the smaller the DNA, the further apart we are. Now, one of the things that you can see here, I hope you can see it from the angle, it's a little bit difficult, but can you see these groups of boxes here? And there's one here and one here. Those are kind of family units. These folks are closer together in terms of relationship. So you can see where I'm at in this box. You can see my daughters, remember talk about 34? You can see my brother, and this is my niece. So I break this down to show how we are all related in the bigger picture, but I'm also breaking it down to show how we are related in the closer family units. So that when I start to ask questions, I can see where we fit into the picture. You tracking with me? Okay, all right, we're gonna move on to the next piece here. Now, the next one that I'm gonna show you is how, remember I showed you the picture of the 23 chromosomes and how Donna and I matched? I'm gonna show you another picture that shows how I match all of these people on that you know, how we share our DNA. Don't glaze over. Crazy, huh? Now, the interesting thing about this is, remember, I share the most DNA with whom? My daughters. Look at how this breaks out. You can see the light blue and the dark blue for, these are my daughters on every chromosome. We share on every chromosome because we're so close together, okay? Then you see all these other pieces here. So what I have done here, the next slide that I'm going to show you is just how I relate to these, because since my daughters and my brother are so close together, they're not going to help me answer questions further out. So I'm going to pull them out of the conversation, okay? All right, so stick with me here. See if this works. There we go. But that changes a lot, doesn't it? Oh my gosh. So this starts to get you to think about what do you need? Sometimes too much data can overwhelm what it is that you're trying to do. But if we start looking at second cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins, it allows us to start to answer questions and see where some of these building blocks are connected to one another. So you can see spaces like these here and these here, where we're all sharing the same stretches of DNA. These are indicators about how we connect with other people outside of the family. Okay, so we're going to take the next big step here to our case study. And my case study is going to talk about my great-grandmother, Cora Joseph, who I illustrated here just a moment ago. So to remind you, my connection with Cora, I'm down there on the bottom left, and this is Cora right here. I'll give you a little bit of background about Cora before we talk about the DNA piece of this. Cora was born around 1847. She died in 1912. She was born in Pass Christian, Mississippi, and she died in Denver, Colorado. When she was 5 years old, she lost both parents to illness. So we don't know who her parents were. We have surnames, but we're not sure. So my question is, who were Cora's parents? I want to know who my grandparents were on the Cora Joseph side. So I started this project with the hope that I could begin to do this. Now, I got to tell you, I started this project in 2016. So I've been doing this for a while, and I still haven't completed the work. There's still work to do here, but I want to show you how I have progressed over the course of the time that we've been working on this. So here's the pedigree chart that we've been talking about. There I am on the left-hand side, and there's Cora down there on the bottom right. And I'm looking for Cora's parents. We think that her father, in our folklore, father's name was Baker, and the mother's name was Lane, L-A-I-N-E, but we've seen it spelled L-A-N-E. So that's always a question. And we think about other things we can use to learn about people. Here's another obituary. But look how tattered that obituary is. Oh my gosh, trying to read this for me was just incredible. But as a result of getting this obituary that we found, we were able to extract a lot of information. Remember we were talking about that earlier? How much information you can get out of this? Well, we learned that Pass Christian was where she was born, that she lost her parents around age 8. Another place we saw she was age 6. She went to New Orleans where she married my great-grandfather, Peter Joseph, and they married in 1864. So I started to try to put this together. Remember I said that she lost both parents, and I've been trying to understand how illness swept through New Orleans. When you think about New Orleans, it was a melting pot of people coming and going, and it was a high slave trade area. So one of the things I started to look at was how did people, what was going on in terms of mortality? Well, here's a yellow fever epidemic mortality chart. So born in 1847, look at 1853. So the chances of her parents having passed away during that stretch are probably pretty good. And this was for white people. This wasn't for African Americans. This was for white. And so a lot of times deaths weren't even reported. So it might have even been higher than the data that we're seeing here. But it's another one of those little pieces that you can add to the story as you're trying to tell the story. What's the narrative of Cora Joseph? We also have her marriage certificate to Peter Joseph. And you can see here, although it's very difficult, Cora Lane, L-A-I-N-E. So that's another hard piece of information that allows us to know that it's Lane, not L-A-N-E. And there it also shows the date over on the right-hand side. This was during the Civil War. I could go into Peter Joseph and her husband a lot, but we don't have time to do that today, but it's really pretty cool. Okay. Let's see if this is gonna, so the next thing I'm going to show you here is we're talking about mitochondrial DNA. Remember, it talks about the mother's line back. And so the test that the 4 of us took allows us to understand, even though we don't know the names of my great-great-grandmother and my great-great-great-great-grandmother and those back, I can tell through mitochondrial DNA where they originated. It's called a haplogroup. And so one of the things I began to do was to build this chart that shows how we're connected. So you can see the 4 test takers down at the bottom. You can see our mothers there, the next row. Then you can see our great-grandmothers who were sisters, okay? And all of these people were descendants of Korah. Just going to jump to the end here. I'm not going to. So the way mitochondrial DNA and Y DNA are broken down, they're broken down into what are called haplogroups. These are groups of people that share portions of their DNA. And as a result of a lot of research, we can look at where these groups originated around the world, whether it's European or African or whatever. And so the big point that I want to share with you here is that as a result of taking this mitochondrial DNA test, and we were identical, is that our haplogroup is called L2A1F. I mean, there are thousands of these, but this is ours, and it points to kind of the Nigerian portion of Africa. So while we cannot say the person's name, who was actually brought from Africa, we know that on Korah's mother's line, maternal line, someone was transported to this country, probably enslaved, from Africa. Pretty interesting, isn't it? I mean, that's just one question. So now we're going to start to look at a different question. I'm interested, as I said, I'm interested in trying to understand who's Korah's parents and ancestry was. So I go on to Ancestry. You may be familiar with Family Tree DNA. That's another place. There's Family Search. There's MyHeritage, that all have kind of DNA components that you can take a test. Some of them you can share, and other places, if you're not familiar with this, there's a place where you can aggregate your DNA called GEDmatch, which allows you to put your DNA there and to look at, it's kind of a clearinghouse. And if you're familiar with some of these shows where they talk about DNA and finding the guy who's the serial killer and stuff, the police have been using that database in the last 5-10 years to help answer questions. So I'm using it to try to understand what's going on with Korah. And I came across a match that stood out to me. This match is with a woman from New Orleans. Wow, New Orleans. So, and it took me, I'll tell you, 2.5 years to crack this code. We were talking earlier before the class started that some people don't want to play. You know, they may have taken DNA tests, but they're doing it for different reasons. They're not doing it for the reason that you're interested in. So it's taken me a couple of years to crack the code to help them to see that they could help me and I could help them and we could learn things together. And by the way, we're cousins. So Marilee and I share 46 centimorgans of DNA. It's pretty small compared to what we were looking at through that thing. But then, so I put together, this is my hypothesis. There I am on the right in the blue, SH, and there's Marilee on the left, that somewhere back in our greats, we have a common ancestor. And I want to find out if I can figure out who that great is. So the next thing I did is I compared Marilee to the other people on that chart. And that's what I'm going to show you here. Look at that. So Marilee doesn't only match me, she matches everybody else. That's pretty good evidence, right? It's like, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. I think we're on to something. So Marilee shares DNA with all of us. So this is kind of an evidential piece of information that says there's more here than just it being random, because DNA can also be random. So the next step is, can I get, in order to do this kind of work, you have to have a family tree. If you're starting to look at who is connected, you got to know who the people are. So I started to stalk Marilee. You know, as I was talking to her, I started to stalk her and try to, you know, that's too strong a word. I'll give you that. But I began to try to understand what her ancestry was. She had a tree, it was pretty small, but I began to try to figure out what her tree looked like. The next slide I'm going to show you is my attempt to try to put together what the family tree looked like. Whoa. So pinks and blues, male, female. You can see over here, here's Marilee. And I basically built this on my own without input from her, because I'm asking her, hey, do you have a tree you can share? And then over here, here's Steve. And so what I was trying to do is I'm trying to work my way back. Tracking with me? So over here on the right, you can see decades, or I guess millennia. So we have 2000, 1900, 1800. So I'm trying to put people in the right generations to see what we can do. I'm trying to look at the surnames, see those? And the goal is trying to figure out who in here is the guy. Who's the guy? And that takes some work and some energy and some patience in terms of making this happen. Meanwhile, I'm working the email line saying, hey, Marilee, you know, I'm Steve. I'd like to get to, you know, to talk to you. Are you willing to do that? Well, it turns out we were able to get this done, but only after I contacted one of her daughters who kind of vouched and says, this guy's okay. Let's do this. But it was fun, and we've become pretty good friends. So we're getting a little more complex now. This is actually on Marilee's chart, coupled with other people who have taken DNA that I have found on Ancestry. Okay, so stay with me here. Here's Marilee. You can see Marilee's immediate family. You with me? We have a cousin. Here's some other cousins. Marilee doesn't know most of these people, by the way. She knows some of them, but not all of them. And then we have this, look how far back we go. And we have cousins down here that are also matches to Marilee. It just blew my mind. So as we're looking at, remember, smaller is farther apart, larger is closer. All of this shows up here. And so this is Marilee's chart, and now we have to pick it apart. How do we pull this stuff together? So the next thing that I did is that I began to look at all of the males in this area right here. So you got to think about, so I mean, we're looking at a male. So who are the males that were in the right place, that were born at the right time, that could have possibly been the parent? So I felt like Jerry Springer now. Who is the daddy? So I began to put together tables, simple spreadsheets, but I started to put together tables based on, remember the colors that you saw in the last one? These are the family groupings. You can see kind of, are they direct lines to Marilee? Could they be the dad or the granddad? Their birth date, their location, their age at 1847. Why is that important? That's the year that Cora was born. Okay, so you know, where were they? And were they deceased in 1847? Well, that kind of tells you that one doesn't fit, right? You know, what date, what year did they die, and where were they located when they died? So it starts to, again, remember we're talking about the fan principle? We've created this cloud, right? Where we're looking at what's going on here. So this was my first cut at trying to look at a potential common ancestor. And this was my second cut, to look at it a little more deeply. And so what I tried to do is I started looking at year by year by year. And so when we think about this year, 1847, this is when Cora was born. So now we can cut across and we can look at where people were, what their ages were, when she was born. So if you're thinking about young men who are potential fathers, you know, could be anywhere from 15 to 50, right? So all of these people are in the pool. So what we can then start to do, you know, after, as we're building this information, so put this on the side here, the next thing we want to do is, can we look at the DNA cloud associated with Mary Lee's family? Okay, so the next thing I'm going to show you is the DNA cloud for Mary Lee's family. So when I got all of the Eustace of the Eves to play, this is how they're connected to each other. So it's the same thing I showed you with my family. Remember, it showed the cloud and how they are connected. You can see how they all kind of interact in terms of distance to each other. The difference between the colors, the red color are DNA and autosomal DNA tests that were done in 23andMe. That was the one I didn't mention earlier. But all the others were done in Ancestry. Okay, so all of these, and so this chart just simply shows who are the people in this chart and how they related to Mary Lee. Okay? You're still with me, right? All right. So now we're going to compare Mary Lee's cloud to my cloud. That seems logical to do the next step, right? I'm trying to walk you through this so you don't glaze over on me. So I'm sorry if I'm being too small here, but so here is the first attempt to bring these two clouds together. And you can see where Mary Lee and I are in the same spot, right? Okay, so now we are going to look at, we're going to add in here how other people match the other cloud, okay? What do you think? Are there some matches? There are a few. There's some places where there are gaps. You can see the places where 23andMe kind of helps to fill in some gaps. But this is not something that's random. The point here is trying to determine whether this is a random connection or something that's got some teeth. And the fact that there are multiple people in my tree that match multiple people in her tree tells us that this is the real deal. All right. So the next step is, are there other groups of families that, yes, you have a question?
I'm following you, I'm with you.
Yep.
But this chart here, where is the connection?
Where is the connection?
I mean, because you.
So
Yeah.
here's me and here's Mary Lee, right?
Okay, yes,
So you can see how Steve and Mary Lee connect.
okay, got it,
You tracking with me?
yes.
But now you can see how all of these other Josephs also connect with Mary Lee, and they connect with Mary Lee's relatives as well.
Okay,
Does that help?
the red, the what's in red?
Like right here?
No, the circle.
Oh, these right here.
That's, yeah, the space,
Those are simply gaps because these are people that didn't match.
okay.
And I point those out because it's important to look at those to see whether it's real that they didn't match or it's fake. The point is that these folks, so one of the things to look at is, how do they relate to Mary Lee? So if we look at Eve 6 and Mary Lee, this is 1600, so it's probably a sister.
Gotcha. Okay.
They didn't get the same DNA that Mary Lee got. That's the point that I want. That's the important point of showing how there's gaps there, is they didn't get this, the section. It's DNA heredity it's random.
Yes.
We don't know what we're gonna get. Yeah.
You mentioned that some of Mary Lee's relatives took the 23andMe test. Is
Yeah,
that-
that's the red. Those are the ones in red.
Okay.
Yep. So you can see most of them are ancestry. And the reason that I use ancestry is because that has the biggest pool.
Yes.
Yes.
And that's why, you know, when I build my projects, I try to get people to do 23andMe, although if they want to do a test or they've already done another test, that's okay. But what I ultimately do is I use these groupings and I ask people for their permission to then put it into that larger GEDmatch system that allows me to look at it in even larger context.
Mhm.
Any other questions on this slide? I just want to make sure that you're tracking with me.
Just
Yeah.
real quick, did you say you encourage people to do ancestry or 23?
Ancestry.
Okay.
Yep, that's where I start. Simply because the number of people that have taken that since its inception is probably 3 times larger than any of the other companies. And so when you start putting people in there or they take a test, you have more people to compare to. It doesn't mean that others are bad or different. It just means that there's a bigger pool to start with. Okay, all right. So the next step for me here was to look at, are there other people that our 2 groups also match with? And the reason that's important is because if they are more distant cousins, it may give us clues on where those, which line we should be looking at. So the next slide I'm going to show you is that. I was able to track down 3 other different clouds. So you can see our cloud up there in the upper left, right? That's the same thing you just saw just a moment ago. And we have 3 other clouds that we have added to this grouping. So I show it here before I give you what the connections were, just so you can see that I want to show their nuclear groupings, all right? These are further distant cousins, 2nd, 3rd, 4th cousins, 5th cousins. All right, so here we go. Stay with me. Take a deep breath. Cinch it up. Here's how that cloud grouping kind of matches with Marilee. Okay, because I'm interested in Marilee at this point, so I'm starting with Marilee. Who are the other people that she matches with? And so that's what we've done here in the lower right. So now we're going to include how they match with my grouping. Everybody take a deep breath. So it's in this information that we were looking at before. Remember, we were looking at the purple that matched Marilee's grouping, right? So now we are looking at the purple that matches these other groupings. Okay, you with me? And you can see here are some that don't match, here are some that do match. And here are a couple that also are pretty good matches. And I draw the triangle here to show you that I'm trying to use the method called triangulation. I match Marilee, Holmes matches Marilee, and Holmes matches me. So the fact that we all match each other is important. And so now we need to look at Holmes's chart. So that by looking at Holmes's family tree, perhaps we can start to see where these pieces intersect. And if we can find that, we may have found a common ancestor. Does that make sense? Okay. So start to build the tree. And this is what we were able to come with. So I've taken a lot of the noise out of this. All of those other cousins and stuff of Marilee, we can rule a lot of pieces out. So the important things that I want you to see here is here's Steve, and here are my cousins that we were talking about before. Here's Cora, the person that was not my target in terms of trying to answer questions. Okay. Over here is Marilee. This is a first cousin here. actually a second cousin, I'm sorry. And then we have Holmes. This is Holmes, one of the person that we were triangulating with. And you can see Holmes has a tree that goes back several generations. Holmes matches Mary Lee. Holmes matches Steve. We were looking at the potential males that could be the potential father or grandfather. We come down to these three men here. But those men are also the offspring of the common ancestor for Mary Lee as well as Steve. Make sense?
Yes, yes.
So the things that we don't have here is we don't have who the actual father is. The only way that we're going to know that is if we have a little more information. You know, and that's part of the challenge with doing a project like this, is you don't always have everything that you need. But we're a lot closer than when we started, right? I can definitively say that I have an ancestor here. Let's see, we're talking about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 generations that are related to these folks. But then I can also start to ask the question, so who is that? Well, here is the answer. BH is Elizabeth Holmes, and JB is Jean Louis Barbarin. Barbarin is a Frenchman. He fought in the Revolutionary War. He came to the US to fight in the war. Elizabeth was born in Baltimore, Maryland. She died in New Orleans. And so for me, the key now is to learn more about this couple. It's learn more about Barbarin and came from, now I know I got somebody from France. Remember you talking about that ethnicity piece down at the beginning? Yeah, there it is, baby. So it allows us to start to answer questions. But the important thing I want to leave you with this is that there are still a lot of questions to answer. You know, for every answer that you get, you probably get 10 more. You said 2. I'm going to say there's probably 10 more questions. So got just a couple more slides. I just resources to assist you. Some things here that you might find interesting and useful. Some things online. You know, you would ask about Afrogenesis. There's the link to that. Yeah.
John Barbarin,
Mm-hmm.
was he in that group, the slide before that, was he in a group of the other teachers? He's there, okay, there he is, okay. And
So I had to figure out here,
That's another one, okay. And that's, and the,
because she was married twice. He died.
Mhm.
She marries him.
she married him, and then that's LB and WB and LH are their sons.
These are sons of EH,
Okay,
and this is a grandson.
gotcha.
You with me?
Yes, yes, yes.
And this is why it's kind of fun to bounce it off of people who haven't seen this before, because it needs to make sense.
Mhm.
As I'm working to try to help Mary Lee and her family understand what's going on, are the things that I'm presenting and putting them into, you know, context. Does it provide the message that's necessary? And that's the challenge that you will have as you're trying to do your work, is your writing needs to be clear, your documents and your graphs need to be clear for 2 reasons, multiple reasons. One, for you, so when you come back to them 3 years later, you know where you picked up, you know, you can pick up a little easier. And 2, when your son or daughter finds it after you're gone, it's like, what was mom or dad thinking about with this thing? Is that I want them to have a roadmap. I want them to be able to pick up where I left off and say, ooh, there's something more, or, you know, technology changes. We can answer more questions in 2050 than we can answer in 2023. So we'll just Answer questions.
So Steve,
Yeah.
when you looked at Marylene's tree and the tree of the third person in the triangle.
Yeah.
How important was it for you to verify how they built their tree? Was it based on folklore or did they actually verify the people in the tree?
So that, I always say, my motto is trust but verify.
Mm-hmm.
And so they built their tree how they built their tree,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And so it's up to me as the person that's following up to then do due diligence to validate that. And so what I don't want to do is say, hey, Marilyn, you didn't do enough. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take that tree and I'm going to do the work I need to do to validate what's there. Hopefully there are records, which there have been.
Yeah.
And so I add to that so that I can make it clear for me.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's really important. So I want to open up the floor to both Lori and I. So, you know, any questions that you all had, please, yes.
Have you looked at the genealogy department at BYU University?
I haven't gone to BYU, but I have gone to Utah and looked at the Mormon library there, yes. Mhm.
That's helpful?
It's very helpful. Yeah.
You would be surprised how much stuff that they have got that would be helpful. But and it's helpful for so many reasons. I mean, we've got situations where the Black nuclear family is intact, but on all of my trees, I have Europeans that have played a role in me being here today. And so trying to look at those records through that lens and understanding that it's not just about African-American genealogy, it's about genealogy. It's like no stone unturned. And so going to a place like the Mormon Church, to their library, there can be a wealth of information. And to their credit, they are working very hard to enlarge their holdings that speak to the backgrounds and the genealogy of African-American families. Donna?
So on Ancestry, under the DNA section, they have something that's, I guess, relatively new, it's called the through lines.
Mm-hmm.
So are the through lines that they're showing there essentially what you've done?
The through lines are based on their software being able to look at trees
True.
and you being attached to the tree using your DNA. So it says Donna is on, here's where she is on this tree, and it has all these surnames and it's crawling those, you know, millions of names and says, we have something that might work here.
Okay.
Trust
And
but
verify,
verify.
yeah, because it is based on how the other people built their tree and whether or not the information is been validated.
Okay.
One of the things that I find is that a lot of people take my tree and put it into their tree,
Yes.
and I'll get a leaf that says so-and-so, and it's my stuff.
Oh,
That drives me nuts. And it's not that I want it out there so other people can use it, but it's like an echo chamber. And so a lot of times it's a lot of stuff that you may have done, but not always, not always. Good question. Other questions, thoughts? You can unbuckle your seatbelts now. So,
Lori, I think you mentioned a letter of warning. Did I wrote letter of warning, and I want to know where was that? It's in the court records, I think, somewhere. It was, let's see if I can figure out where it was. You showed us the map of where ancestors may have moved around. It was right before that.
That was a broadsheet for 6 enslaved people who left on Christmas Eve to seek their freedom. That brought, that one.
I think that's,
So that actually is in a repository in Chicago, but it is a documented story here in Loudoun County about these freedom seekers, because of their story when they got to Pennsylvania and then further north, it was, it was documented, it was told to William Still.
Yes, okay.
So that's not at the courthouse. As I said, that's in a repository.
Okay.
How did you find it?
Actually, another researcher here in Loudoun County went looking for the broadsheet. It was mentioned in a book, actually. It was mentioned in a book. It was pictured in a book. And she just wanted to track down where exactly is the original, and she got copies. Not a lot of them remain, unfortunately, but this one did.
You mentioned William Still because I was wondering if in any of your, either of your researches, did you find his book valuable for connecting families?
Go ahead.
I did not find it helpful for the well, I've used him his book for two projects. One helped provide information from the narrative that was given to him to figure out who could it have been during that time period in Loudoun, because it was a reference to a Baptist minister in Leesburg. And was the only one. And then another, there are notes that he took that he used to write the book. And those notes can sometimes be more detailed. The notes are what helped with another project related to the George Carters, because there were 3 George Carters in Loudoun at the same time. And the freedom seeker, people have assumed it was George Carter at Oatlands, and it wasn't, another George Carter. So the book has been, and the notes have been helpful.
Thank you.
Donna?
So Lori, I just wanted to walk through what you talked about when it comes to wills.
Mhm.
So there's the actual will,
Possibly.
possible will, and then what is probated, what you find in the court records is the probated. And then you said that you could also, I guess, associated with the will would be the type of accounting that would come afterwards, like looking at inventories, appraisals.
And the accounting, the estate accounting records.
Which would be at courthouse?
Yes. So in an ideal situation, the person who died had a will. And unlike George Carter of Oatlands, who said in his will, my estate does not need to be inventoried. So there's no inventory or appraisal for the largest enslaver in Loudoun County, which is extremely frustrating. But that happens rarely. So there would be a will, there would be an inventory and an appraisal. And then if everything was settled from that, it was very straightforward, it would end there. But often if it goes on, like during the time period of Joseph Lewis's case study, the executors or the administrators have to account to the court where the money's going. And if because you have to be bonded, you still do today. If you're bonded, where are you spending some of that money? Right? Where is the revenue coming in and the money going out?
And so I would go to, so you know where I'm looking, Sumter, South Carolina, so I would ask them specifically about inventory.
Yes.
County
Yes.
Courthouse, yeah.
Yes.
I would just add that we are extremely fortunate by the extended record keeping that exists in this county. If you're looking for people in this county, you are a step ahead from most counties. An example for me is King William County in Virginia, and that county was burned. And it's had several courthouse fires. And so the number of records that exist there are slim. And so it's very, very difficult. So if you're working here, just recognize, even though you may get frustrated, recognizing that you've probably got a better, chance of finding something than in other places. The other thing that we didn't really talk a whole lot about was the Library of Virginia. The Library of Virginia is a treasure trove of stuff.
Yeah.
And if you haven't spent time there, it's worth going there. I would say to familiarize yourself with it. And then on a subsequent trip, taking time to actually do some research. I mean, they've got a lot of chancery court records there that cover the state in general. And, as we think about people moving from one county to another, that particular repository offers you the opportunity to look across counties a little more consistently.
And they have a new project, I think it's called Unknown No Longer, but it's online and it's with pulling the records that they have about enslaved people together. And so they've been really promoting that. It's great work.
Glad you mentioned the Library of Virginia, because I was born and raised in Norfolk, in Virginia. So there was a Black newspaper there, so I used to subscribe to the newspaper.com. Those newspapers are in that repository. Might they be in the Library of Virginia? It was called the Journaling Guide. And it had a lot of the information.
That's a great
about
question. A
America.
lot of those papers, just didn't get saved, but the Library of Virginia would be in my words, an obvious place to ask questions. I mean, they have a lot of information. I don't know if there are an historical society down in Norfolk that would potentially have more localized information there, but clearly looking at the state library and locally are going to be your best bet, I think.
But I think it is preserved somewhere, and for some reason, I think I found it in Penn State somewhere, but there is a version of new journaling.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
There are universities around this country who are beginning to do more of this work.
Yeah.
And they are becoming repositories, and they're just now getting good at letting people know, that it's there. So discovery is becoming easier, but for now, you got to continue to do that research. So that's a really important point to remember. Any last questions? Yes.
You mentioned abstracts and indexes. I know what indexes. What's an abstract?
So an abstract, the person who's doing that work takes the most relevant information out of it. So it's a little bit more of, a paragraph form. So for example, from one of Pat's books, it might be like with a deed, who's selling, who's buying, how much, the description, but it leaves off all of the standard verbiage.
It's a thumbnail
Yeah.
of
That's
what
better.
you'll
It's a thumbnail.
of what you'll find.
Okay.
Well, we have really enjoyed this. I hope you can tell how excited I am to talk about this stuff. I mean, I love talking about this stuff, and I know Lori loves sharing the work that she's doing. And we wish you the very best on your search. And if there are things that we can do to answer questions or to provide support, all you got to do is ask. Thank you.